The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Bobby Chen shuffled down the sidewalk, his worn hiking boots making soft sounds against the concrete. At 72, his shoulders carried a slight stoop, and his gray hair had thinned to wisps that danced in the gentle breeze. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another elderly man taking his daily walk through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Bobby stopped at the corner coffee shop, the same one he'd visited every morning for the past 3 years since moving to Millfield. The young barista, Sarah, always greeted him with a warm smile and had his order ready before he reached the counter. Black coffee, no sugar, and a plain bagel. It was a simple routine that brought him comfort in his retirement years. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Mr. Chen?" Sarah asked as she handed him his usual order. "Every day above ground is beautiful," Bobby replied with a gentle smile, leaving a generous tip in the jar before heading to his favorite bench in the small park across the street. The park was Bobby's sanctuary. He'd sit on the same wooden bench under the old oak tree, watching the world wake up around him. Young mothers pushed strollers along the walking path. Joggers huffed past with determination, and occasionally, teenagers would skateboard through the area despite the no skating signs posted throughout the park. On this particular Tuesday morning, Bobby noticed a group of college-aged kids gathering near the playground. They were loud and boisterous, clearly having started their day with something stronger than coffee. Their leader, a tall young man with bleached blonde hair and multiple tattoos covering his arms, kept glancing in Bobby's direction with a smirk. "Look at that old fossil," the blonde kid said loud enough for Bobby to hear. "Probably sits there all day because he's got nothing better to do." Bobby continued sipping his coffee, his expression unchanged. He'd learned long ago that some people's words said more about them than about their targets. The group's laughter echoed across the park as they continued their crude commentary. A young woman with bright pink hair joined in. "Betty falls asleep sitting up. My grandpa does that all the time. It's kind of pathetic." Their comments grew bolder as they realized Bobby wasn't reacting. They began making exaggerated gestures, pretending to stumble and mock his walking style from the day before. The blonde leader, who introduced himself loudly as Tank, seemed to feed off the attention from his friends. Bobby finished his coffee and stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. As he walked toward the trash can to dispose of his cup, Tank stepped directly into his path. "Excuse me, sir," Bobby said politely, his voice calm and steady. "Oh, excuse me, sir," Tank mimicked in a high-pitched voice, causing his friends to burst into laughter. "What's the hurry, old man? Got a hot date at the senior center?" Bobby simply stepped around him and continued to the trash can. He could feel their eyes following him, waiting for a reaction that never came. This only seemed to frustrate Tank more. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Tank called out, his voice taking on an edge. "Don't you have any respect for young people?" Bobby turned around slowly, his gray eyes meeting Tank's. For just a moment, Tank felt something shift in the air, a quiet intensity that made him take an unconscious step backward. But the moment passed quickly, and Bobby simply nodded. "Have a good day," Bobby said before continuing on his way. The group watched him leave, their mockery temporarily subdued by something they couldn't quite identify. Tank shook off the feeling and forced another laugh. "What a weirdo," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. As Bobby walked home, he passed by Martha Hendricks, his 70-year-old neighbor who was tending to her garden. Martha had become something of a friend over the past few years, often bringing him homemade cookies or inviting him over for dinner on holidays. "Morning, Bobby," she called out, straightening up from her rose bushes. "How was your coffee today?" "Same as always," he replied, pausing at her garden gate. "How are the roses coming along?" "Better than expected. These old hands still remember how to make things grow." She glanced toward the park where the group of young people was still visible. "Those kids giving you trouble again?" Bobby had mentioned the occasional harassment from various groups of teenagers and young adults who seemed to view the park as their territory. Martha had witnessed some of their behavior and wasn't shy about expressing her disapproval. "Nothing I can't handle," Bobby said simply. Martha studied his face with the wisdom that comes from raising 5 children and managing a classroom of 3rd graders for 35 years. She sensed there was more to Bobby's story than he let on, but she respected his privacy. "Well, you know where to find me if you need anything," she said. Bobby nodded and continued toward his small rental house at the end of the street. The modest two-bedroom home was perfect for his needs, quiet, clean, and within walking distance of everything he needed. He'd chosen Millfield specifically because it was the kind of place where people minded their own business and left each other alone. Inside his house, Bobby moved through his morning routine with the same precision he'd maintained for decades. He made his bed with military corners, washed his coffee cup until it sparkled, and settled into his favorite armchair to read the newspaper. The house was sparse but comfortable, with few personal items visible to casual visitors. On his bookshelf, mixed in with novels and biographies, sat a few volumes that might have seemed out of place to someone who didn't know him well. Books on tactical operations, military history, and survival techniques. A casual observer might assume they were just the interests of an old man fascinated by war stories. As Bobby read about local politics and community events, he couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful morning routine was about to be disrupted. In his experience, young men like Tank rarely let things go when they felt they'd been ignored or disrespected. He'd seen that type before, insecure, looking for easy targets to prove their dominance to their peers. But Bobby had also learned patience during his years of service. Sometimes the best strategy was to wait and see what developed, to let others reveal their intentions before deciding on a course of action. For now, he would continue his routine and hope that Tank and his friends would find someone else to entertain them. The next few days passed quietly, and Bobby began to hope that Tank and his group had moved on to other interests. He maintained his morning routine, enjoying his coffee and the peaceful atmosphere of the early hours when the park belonged to joggers and dog walkers rather than troublemakers. However, by Friday morning his hopes were dashed. As he settled onto his usual bench with his coffee and bagel, he noticed the familiar group approaching from the far side of the park. Tank had brought reinforcements this time. At least 8 young people, both men and women, all looking like they were spoiling for entertainment. Well, well, look who's back, Tank announced loudly as they surrounded Bobby's bench. It's our favorite park decoration. A new face in the group, a heavy-set young man with a shaved head and multiple piercings, laughed harshly. Dude, he really does just sit here like a statue. What's wrong with you, old man? Can't afford cable TV? Bobby continued eating his bagel methodically, his eyes focused on the morning joggers passing by on the main path. He'd faced worse intimidation tactics from people far more dangerous than these kids, and their amateur attempts at psychological warfare barely registered. Maybe he's deaf, suggested the pink-haired girl from earlier. She stepped closer and waved her hand in front of Bobby's face. Hello, anybody home in there? When Bobby still didn't react, Tank's frustration became more obvious. He sat down heavily on the bench next to Bobby, deliberately taking up more space than necessary and jostling the older man's arm. You know what I think? Tank said, his voice dropping to what he probably considered a menacing tone. I think you're scared. I think you know you don't belong here and you're just too stubborn to admit it. Bobby finished his bagel and carefully folded the paper wrapper, placing it in his jacket pocket rather than leaving it on the bench. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if Tank wasn't even there. Are you listening to me? Tank demanded, his voice rising. This is our park, old man. We've been coming here since we were kids, and we don't need some creepy old guy watching us all the time. For the first time, Bobby turned to look directly at Tank. His gray eyes were calm but somehow unsettling in their steadiness. This is a public park, Bobby said quietly. I have as much right to be here as anyone else. The simple statement seemed to infuriate Tank even more. Rights? You think you have rights? You're probably living off our tax dollars anyway, sitting around collecting welfare while real people work for a living. Bobby stood up slowly, his movements controlled and precise. I think I'll finish my coffee at home today. But Tank wasn't done. He jumped up and blocked Bobby's path again, this time with several of his friends forming a loose circle around them. No, 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 Tank said with a fake smile. You can't just walk away when someone's talking to you. That's rude. The situation was attracting attention from other park visitors. A young mother with a stroller had stopped on the path, clearly concerned but unsure whether to intervene. An elderly man walking his dog had pulled out his phone and seemed to be debating whether to call someone. Bobby assessed the circle of young people around him with the practiced eye of someone who'd evaluated threats professionally for decades. They were amateurs, loud, sloppy, and telegraphing their intentions with every movement. Tank was clearly the leader, but he was also the most emotional and therefore the most unpredictable. "I don't want any trouble," Bobby said calmly, though those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle shift in his posture. "Trouble?" Tank laughed. "Who said anything about trouble? We're just having a conversation. You seemed lonely sitting here all by yourself every day." The pink-haired girl giggled nervously. "Maybe we should just let him go, Tank. People are starting to stare." "Let him go?" Tank's voice rose again. "He hasn't even answered my questions yet. I asked if he was living off our tax dollars, and I think I deserve an answer." Bobby's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd spent 30 years serving his country, including tours in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and had the scars to prove it. The suggestion that he was somehow a burden on society struck deeper than the rest of their juvenile taunts. "I think you should step aside," Bobby said, his voice still quiet but carrying a new edge that made several of Tank's friends shift uncomfortably. Tank either didn't hear the warning in Bobby's tone or chose to ignore it. He stepped closer, close enough that Bobby could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Or what, old man? You gonna call the cops? Cry to the park ranger?" Tank poked Bobby's chest with his finger. "You gonna tell your nurse at the old folks' home that the mean kids were picking on you?" The poke was a mistake. Bobby's hand moved so quickly that most of the observers missed it entirely. One moment Tank was poking him in the chest, and the next moment Tank's wrist was caught in Bobby's grip, twisted at an angle that made the young man's eyes water. "I said step aside," Bobby repeated, his voice still calm but somehow much more commanding. Tank tried to pull his wrist free, but Bobby's grip was like a steel trap. The pain was immediate and intense, and Tank found himself going up on his toes to relieve the pressure. "Let go of me," Tank gasped, his earlier bravado evaporating. "When you step aside," Bobby replied simply. The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone involved. Tank's friends stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or flee. The mother with the stroller had definitely pulled out her phone now, and several other park visitors had stopped to watch. Finally, Tank nodded frantically, and Bobby released his wrist. Tank stumbled backward, cradling his arm and staring at Bobby with a mixture of pain, confusion, and something that might have been respect. "What the hell was that?" the heavy-set friend demanded, but his voice lacked conviction. Bobby picked up his empty coffee cup and walked calmly toward the trash can, the circle of young people parting automatically to let him pass. As he disposed of his cup, he turned back to face the group. "Have a good day," he said politely, as if the entire confrontation had been a pleasant conversation. Tank was still flexing his wrist, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "This isn't over," he called out as Bobby walked away. Bobby paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Yes, it is," he said simply, and something in his voice made Tank take an involuntary step backward. As Bobby walked home, he could feel the eyes of the entire group following him. He knew he'd made a mistake by engaging physically, even in such a minimal way. It would only escalate things from here. But sometimes, he reflected, people needed to learn that quiet dignity didn't mean weakness. Behind him, Tank was already spinning the story to salvage his reputation, claiming that he'd let the old man go out of kindness rather than admitting he'd been completely helpless in Bobby's grip. But his friends had seen the fear in his eyes, and Tank knew he'd have to do something dramatic to restore his standing as the group's leader. Over the weekend, Tank's humiliation festered like an infected wound. His friends had witnessed an old man make him look weak and helpless, and the story was already spreading through their social circle. By Monday morning, Tank had made a decision that would change everything. He'd recruited his older brother Marcus and 3 of Marcus's friends from the community college. Marcus was 25, worked construction, and had a reputation for settling disputes with his fists rather than words. When Tank explained how some old man had attacked him in the park, Marcus was eager to help restore the family honor. "You let some grandpa punk you?" Marcus had laughed when Tank first told the story. "That's embarrassing, little brother. Good thing Dad's not around to see what you've become." Now, as Bobby made his usual Monday morning walk to the coffee shop, he sensed something different in the air. His years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was telling him that the situation had escalated beyond simple harassment. Sarah at the coffee shop seemed more nervous than usual as she prepared his order. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly. Some guys were in here earlier asking about you. They seemed unfriendly. Bobby nodded calmly. What did they want to know? Just stuff like what time you usually come in, where you live, that kind of thing. I didn't tell them anything, but she glanced around nervously. Maybe you should be careful today. Thank you for the warning, Bobby said, leaving his usual tip and heading toward the park. As he approached his bench, Bobby could see that Tank and his original group were there, but they'd been joined by several older, more serious-looking young men. The newcomers had the kind of casual confidence that came from actually knowing how to fight, unlike Tank's amateur theatrics. Bobby made a quick assessment of the situation. 9 people total, spread out in a way that suggested some level of tactical thinking. The new additions were positioned to cut off escape routes, while Tank's original friends clustered around his usual bench like they owned it. For a moment, Bobby considered simply walking past and heading home. He had nothing to prove to these people, and getting into a serious confrontation wouldn't benefit anyone. But as he started to change direction, Tank spotted him. There he is, Tank called out loudly. There's the tough guy who thinks he can put his hands on people. The group converged on Bobby's position with practiced efficiency. Marcus stepped forward, clearly designated as the spokesman for this more serious confrontation. You the old man who grabbed my little brother? Marcus asked, his voice carrying genuine menace rather than Tank's theatrical bluster. Your brother was blocking my path, Bobby replied calmly. I simply encouraged him to move. Marcus looked Bobby up and down, taking in his slight build and gray hair. You encouraged him? By twisting his wrist like some kind of karate master? Who do you think you are, old man? Bobby remained silent. His hands relaxed at his sides, but his eyes constantly moving to track the positions of all 9 young men. He noticed that 2 of them had positioned themselves behind him while they talked, a basic pincer movement that suggested someone had at least rudimentary knowledge of group tactics. I think you owe my brother an apology, Marcus continued, and maybe a little compensation for the pain and suffering you caused. Tank was practically bouncing with excitement, clearly thrilled to have his older brother handling his problems. Yeah, an apology and maybe $50 for my medical expenses, he added. Bobby almost smiled at the transparent attempt at extortion. I don't think that's going to happen, he said quietly. The words hung in the air for a moment before Marcus's expression hardened. See, that's where you're wrong, old man. You're going to apologize and you're going to pay up, or we're going to have a problem. We already have a problem, Bobby observed. Marcus's friends began closing in. Their movement coordinated enough to suggest they'd done this before, but something about Bobby's complete lack of fear gave them pause. Most victims would be showing signs of panic by now. Elevated breathing, nervous movements, attempts to placate or negotiate. Bobby stood as still as a statue, his gray eyes moving methodically from face to face as if he were memorizing each one. Last chance. Gramps, Marcus said, pulling back his jacket to reveal a knife handle tucked into his belt. Apologize and pay up or things get ugly. The knife changed everything. Bobby's posture shifted subtly, his weight moving to the balls of his feet. His hands remained at his sides, but those with experience would have noticed that his fingers were no longer relaxed. Put the knife away, Bobby said, his voice carrying a new quality that made several of the younger men exchange nervous glances. Or what? Marcus sneered. But there was something in Bobby's tone that made him hesitate to actually draw the weapon. Because once you pull it out, this stops being a simple misunderstanding, Bobby replied, and becomes something else entirely. The park had grown quiet around them. Other visitors had noticed the confrontation and were either leaving quickly or calling for help from a safe distance. Even the usual morning joggers had found alternate routes. Tank, emboldened by his brother's presence and the apparent backing of so many friends, decided to escalate further. He's bluffing, Marcus. Look at him. He's just some old guy who got lucky once. There's 9 of us and 1 of him. Bobby's attention turned to Tank with laser focus. 9 of you, he repeated slowly. Do you really think that's going to be enough? There was something in the way he said it, not as a boast or a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, that sent a chill through the group. Marcus found his hand unconsciously moving away from his knife rather than toward it. One of Marcus's friends, a wiry young man with gang tattoos covering his neck, stepped closer to Bobby. You talk pretty tough for someone who's about to get his ass kicked by a bunch of kids half his age. Bobby turned to face the newcomer directly, What's your name, son? The unexpected question caught the young man off guard. What, why do you care? Because I like to know who I'm dealing with, Bobby replied calmly. And because your mother probably didn't raise you to threaten elderly people in public parks. The mention of his mother hit home harder than any insult could have. The young man's face flushed with anger, but also with something that might have been shame. Don't you talk about my mother, he snarled, stepping even closer. Bobby didn't move back. Then don't give her a reason to be ashamed of you. The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the tension was becoming almost unbearable. Tank was practically vibrating with anticipation, eager to see his tormentor finally get what was coming to him. Marcus was beginning to realize that his little brother might have gotten them into something more complicated than a simple intimidation job. And Bobby stood in the center of it all, calm and ready, like a man who had faced far worse threats than 9 angry young men in a suburban park. The moment stretched taut like a wire, everyone waiting to see who would make the first move. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by a sound that changed everything. A woman's scream from the direction of the playground. Everyone's head turned toward the sound, where a man in dark clothing was struggling with a young mother while her toddler cried nearby. The stranger had grabbed the woman's purse and was now trying to drag her toward the parking lot, clearly intending to take more than just her belongings. For a split second, nobody moved. Tank and his group stood frozen, Marcus's tough guy posturing suddenly seeming ridiculous in the face of a real emergency. The young men looked at each other uncertainly, none of them eager to get involved in something that might actually be dangerous. Bobby didn't hesitate. The moment he heard the scream, his entire demeanor changed. The mild-mannered old man disappeared, replaced by someone who moved with deadly purpose. He was running toward the playground before Tank's group even fully processed what was happening. The attacker was bigger than Bobby, younger and stronger, but he was also focused on his victim and didn't see the elderly man approaching until it was too late. Bobby's first strike was to the man's kidney, a precise blow that dropped him to his knees instantly. Before the attacker could recover, Bobby had twisted his arm behind his back and driven his face into the ground. "Stay down," Bobby said quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. The attacker tried to struggle, reaching for something in his jacket with his free hand. Bobby saw the movement and responded with military precision. He shifted his grip, applied pressure to a nerve cluster in the man's neck, and the attacker went limp immediately. "Is he dead?" the young mother gasped, clutching her child. "Unconscious," Bobby replied, quickly checking the man's pockets and finding a switchblade and zip ties. His expression darkened as he realized this had been planned as more than a simple purse snatching. "Are you hurt?" The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her face. He said he was going to... He said if I didn't come with him." She couldn't finish the sentence. Bobby's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough predators in his career to recognize one immediately. This man hadn't been after money, he'd been hunting. By now, Tank and his group had approached cautiously, staring in shock at the unconscious attacker and the elderly man who had taken him down in less than 10 seconds. The clinical efficiency of Bobby's movements had been unlike anything they'd ever seen, even in movies. "Holy shit," one of them whispered. "Did you see how fast he moved?" Marcus was staring at Bobby with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. "Where did you learn to do that?" Bobby ignored the question, instead pulling out his phone to call 911. As he spoke to the dispatcher, he kept one eye on the unconscious attacker and the other on the surrounding area, automatically scanning for additional threats. "Police and ambulance are on the way," he told the young mother. "What's your name?" "Jessica," she managed. "Jessica Martinez. This is my son, Carlos. I'm Robert Chen. You're safe now, Jessica. The police will want to talk to you, but this man won't hurt you or anyone else." Tank found his voice first among his group. "Dude, what the hell was that? You moved like some kind of ninja or something." Bobby was checking the attacker's pulse and breathing, his movements still professional and methodical. "Just basic self-defense," he said dismissively. "Basic self-defense?" Marcus laughed nervously. "Man, I've been in a lot of fights and I've never seen anything like that. You took him down like he was a child." For the first time since the confrontation began, Bobby looked directly at Marcus and his friends. "Fighting and combat are two very different things," he said simply. The distinction was lost on most of them, but Marcus caught something in Bobby's tone that made him step backward involuntarily. This wasn't some lucky old man who'd gotten in a good shot. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Police sirens were approaching now, and Bobby stood up slowly, his hands visible and away from his body. Years of experience had taught him that police arriving at a chaotic scene needed to be able to quickly identify threats and friendlies. "Sir, step away from the suspect," the first officer called out as he approached with his weapon drawn. "I'm the one who called it in," Bobby replied calmly, moving several steps away from the unconscious attacker. "The victim is over there with her child. She's unharmed but shaken." The officer relaxed slightly but kept his weapon ready. "What happened here?" Bobby gave a concise, factual account of events while the officer took notes. His report was precise and professional, including details that most civilian witnesses would never think to mention: the attacker's approach vector, the weapons found on his person, and the specific techniques used to subdue him. "Are you in law enforcement, sir?" the officer asked. "Retired military," Bobby replied. Tank and his friends were standing off to the side, forgotten in the aftermath of the real emergency. They watched in fascination as Bobby answered the officer's questions with the kind of crisp, professional responses that suggested he'd done this many times before. A second police car arrived, followed by an ambulance. As the paramedics checked on Jessica and her son, another officer approached Tank's group. "Were you witnesses to what happened?" the officer asked. Tank nodded, still trying to process what he'd seen. "That old man, Mr. Chen, he took that guy down like it was nothing. It was incredible." "You know Mr. Chen?" the officer asked. "We were just talking to him when it happened," Marcus said carefully, not wanting to admit they'd been planning to assault the man who had just saved someone from a violent crime. The officer made some notes and moved on to other witnesses. As he walked away, Tank's group found themselves alone with the realization that they'd been about to attack someone who could probably have put all 9 of them in the hospital without breaking a sweat. "Jesus Christ," the wiry young man with the neck tattoos whispered. "Did you see his eyes when he went after that guy? It was like he flipped a switch." Marcus was flexing his fingers nervously. "I've never seen anyone move like that. Not in real life." Tank was staring at Bobby, who was now giving his contact information to the investigating officer. "He's not just some random old guy, is he?" "No," Marcus said slowly. "He's definitely not." As the police finished their initial investigation and the attacker was loaded into an ambulance under guard, Bobby approached Jessica one final time. "The police will follow up with you," he said gently. "But if you need anything, someone to talk to, help with victim services, anything at all, I want you to have my number." Jessica took the card gratefully. "Thank you so much. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Bobby's expression softened. "You don't have to think about that now. Focus on taking care of yourself and your son." As the emergency vehicles pulled away and the park began to return to normal, Tank and his group were left standing awkwardly nearby. The confrontation that had seemed so important just minutes ago now felt petty and ridiculous. Bobby walked back toward his bench to collect his coffee cup, moving past the group as if they were invisible. But Tank couldn't let it end like this. "Mr. Chen," he called out, his voice small and uncertain. Bobby paused and turned around. We... Tank struggled to find words. "Who are you?" Bobby looked at Tank for a long moment, considering the question. The young man's earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine curiosity and what might have been the beginning of respect. "Just a retired soldier," Bobby said finally. "Bullshit," Marcus said, but not disrespectfully. "I know soldiers. My uncle was in the army for 20 years. He never moved like that." Bobby continued toward his bench, but Tank hurried to catch up with him. "Please, Mr. Chen, I was being an ass. I know that now. But what you just did, that wasn't normal." The other members of the group had formed a loose semicircle around Bobby, but their posture was completely different now. Instead of the aggressive stance they'd taken earlier, they stood at a respectful distance waiting for his response. Bobby sat down on his bench and looked up at the 9 young faces staring down at him. For the first time in the 3 years since he'd moved to Millfield, he found himself considering whether to break his self-imposed silence about his past. "What do you really want to know?" he asked. "Everything," Tank said immediately. "If you're willing to tell us." Bobby was quiet for several minutes, watching the morning joggers resume their routines now that the excitement was over. Finally, he spoke. "I served in the military for 30 years, he began. Started as a regular Army infantryman when I was 18. Did my first tour in Vietnam when most of you weren't even born yet." The young men listened intently, hanging on every word. "After Vietnam, I came back and went to college on the GI Bill. Got a degree in engineering. Thought I might leave the Army and build bridges or design buildings, but then I got recruited for something else." "What kind of something else?" the pink-haired girl asked softly. Bobby's gray eyes took on a distant look. "Special operations. The kind of unit that doesn't officially exist, that handles problems the regular military can't solve through conventional means." Marcus felt his throat go dry. "Delta Force?" Bobby nodded slowly. "First Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. I spent 15 years with them, from 1985 to 2000. Mostly classified operations in places that were never supposed to be on any map. The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. Tank felt his knees go weak as he realized how close he'd come to seriously attacking one of the most dangerous soldiers in the world. "Holy shit," someone whispered. "You're like a real-life superhero." Bobby shook his head. "Nothing heroic about it. Just a job that needed doing. But the way you took down that guy," Marcus said, his voice filled with awe, "that was incredible." "Basic combatives," Bobby replied matter-of-factly. "When you're operating behind enemy lines with a small team, you learn to end fights quickly and quietly. You don't have the luxury of a prolonged battle." Tank found his voice. "Have I ever killed anyone?" Bobby finished the question calmly. "Yes, more people than I care to count. Most of them were trying to kill me or my teammates at the time, but that doesn't make it easier to live with." The group fell silent, trying to process the magnitude of what they were hearing. This quiet old man who sat on a park bench every morning had lived a life that was beyond anything they could imagine. "Why are you telling us this?" the wiry young man with the neck tattoos asked. "You could have just let us keep thinking you were nobody special." Bobby looked at him directly. "Because you asked. And because maybe it's time someone learned something from my mistakes." "Mistakes?" Tank asked. "I spent 30 years learning how to hurt people," Bobby said. "Learning how to solve problems with violence. And you know what I figured out after all that time?" The group waited expectantly. "Violence is easy. Any fool can learn to throw a punch or pull a trigger. The hard part is learning when not to use what you know. The hard part is walking away when every instinct tells you to fight." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "But you didn't walk away just now. You saved that woman." "That was different," Bobby said firmly. "That woman was in real danger from a real predator. What you were planning to do to me was just ego and stupidity." Tank felt his face burn with shame. "We were really going to. All 9 of us against one old man." "You were going to try," Bobby corrected. "Whether you would have succeeded is another question entirely." The statement was delivered so calmly that it took a moment for the implications to sink in. Marcus found himself unconsciously touching the knife he'd threatened Bobby with earlier, wondering how long he would have remained conscious if he'd actually drawn it. "What would you have done?" Tank asked quietly. "If we'd actually attacked you?" Bobby was silent for a long moment. "The minimum necessary to protect myself," he said finally. "But you have to understand, 30 years of training doesn't just disappear because I'm retired. My definition of minimum necessary might be very different from yours." The pink-haired girl spoke up. "Were you scared? When we surrounded you, I mean?" Bobby considered the question. "No, disappointed maybe. Sad that a group of young people with their whole lives ahead of them were about to make such a terrible mistake, but not scared. Not even a little?" Marcus pressed. "There were 9 of us." Bobby turned to look at him directly. "Son, I've been outnumbered by better people than you in places a lot more dangerous than this park. 9 college kids with more mouth than sense?" He shook his head. "That's not something that keeps me awake at night." The casual dismissal was somehow more intimidating than any threat could have been. Tank realized that to Bobby, their entire group had registered as barely worth his attention. "So what happens now?" Tank asked. "Are you going to report us to the police?" Bobby shook his head. "For what? Standing around and talking tough? No crime in that." "But we were going to," Tank started. "We're going to isn't the same as did," Bobby interrupted. "You made a mistake, but you didn't follow through with it. Sometimes that's the best you can hope for." Marcus found himself asking the question that had been nagging at him. Why didn't you just tell us who you were from the beginning? If you'd known, you would have left me alone out of fear, not respect, Bobby replied. And the next old man you decided to hassle might not have been so fortunate. The group stood in uncomfortable silence, processing the weight of their own behavior. They'd been bullying an elderly man for their own entertainment, never considering that he might be someone's grandfather, someone's hero, someone who had sacrificed more for his country than they could possibly imagine. Mr. Chen, Tank said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry. Bobby nodded. Apology accepted. But don't apologize to me. Apologize to yourselves. You're all better than what you were about to do today. As if on cue, Tank's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and his face went pale. What is it? Marcus asked. Tank held up his phone so the others could see. It was a news alert about the arrest that had just taken place in their park. The headline read, Suspected serial predator arrested after being subdued by local veteran. They're already calling you a hero, Tank said. Looking at Bobby with new eyes, Bobby stood up and brushed off his jacket. I'm just an old man who did what needed to be done. The real heroes are the ones who choose to do what's right even when no one's watching. He started to walk away, then paused and looked back at the group one final time. You all have a choice to make now. You can keep being the kind of people who pick on others for entertainment, or you can be something better. The choice is yours. As Bobby walked away, the group stood in stunned silence, each of them grappling with the realization that they'd almost made the biggest mistake of their lives. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the park, and Millfield had returned to its quiet routine. The story of the local hero who stopped a predator had run in the newspaper for several days, though Bobby had refused all interview requests and asked that his photo not be published. The reporter had respected his wishes, referring to him only as a local veteran who wished to remain anonymous. Tank sat on the same bench where he'd first mocked Bobby, but everything felt different now. He came to the park every morning not to cause trouble but to think. The weight of how close he'd come to attacking a genuine American hero had been crushing him for weeks. His grades had actually improved since the incident. The realization that he'd been wasting his time and energy on pointless aggression had sparked something like a personal awakening. He'd even started reading about military history, trying to understand the kind of life Bobby had lived. Marcus had been even more affected by the encounter. He'd quit his construction job and enrolled in community college, telling everyone that he wanted to do something meaningful with his life. The memory of standing over Bobby with a knife, thinking he was intimidating some helpless old man, had haunted him more than he cared to admit. You think he'll show up today? Marcus asked, joining Tank on the bench. He's been here every morning for 3 weeks, Tank replied. Why would today be different? They'd taken to watching for Bobby from a distance, not approaching him but simply observing. None of them had worked up the courage to speak to him again since that day, though Tank had wanted to many times. At exactly 8:15, Bobby appeared on the path from the coffee shop, carrying his usual black coffee and plain bagel. He looked the same as always, a quiet, unassuming elderly man taking his morning walk. But now Tank saw something else in his posture, in the way he moved through space with unconscious confidence. Bobby settled onto his usual bench and began his morning routine. Tank and Marcus watched from across the park, joined gradually by several other members of their former group. They'd all been coming to the park more regularly since the incident, though none of them were quite sure why. I have to talk to him, Tank said suddenly. What are you going to say? Marcus asked. I don't know. Something. Anything. I can't just keep sitting here feeling guilty forever. Tank stood up and walked slowly across the park. His heart was racing as he approached Bobby's bench, but he forced himself to keep moving. Bobby looked up as he approached, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. Mr. Chen, Tank said, his voice uncertain. Could I? Would it be okay if I sat down? Bobby gestured to the empty space on the bench. It's a public park. Tank sat down carefully, leaving plenty of space between them. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Tank found his voice. I've been thinking about what you said, about choosing to be better. Bobby nodded but didn't respond, waiting for Tank to continue. I used to think strength meant making other people afraid of you, Tank said. But watching you that day, the way you handled that situation, I realized I don't know anything about real strength. Strength isn't about making people afraid, Bobby agreed. Real strength is protecting people who can't protect themselves. Tank thought about Jessica Martinez and her son, about how Bobby had moved to help them without a moment's hesitation. I want to learn how to do that. How to be like that? Bobby turned to look at him more directly. What does that mean to you? I don't know yet, Tank admitted. Maybe join the military. Maybe become a police officer. Maybe just be the kind of person who helps instead of hurts. Those are all good options, Bobby said, but they're just jobs. The real question is what kind of man you want to be, regardless of what you do for a living. Tank nodded, understanding the distinction. I want to be the kind of man you are. Bobby was quiet for a long moment. I'm not a perfect man, Tank. I've made mistakes, hurt people I shouldn't have, failed when others needed me to succeed. Don't put me on a pedestal. But you served your country for 30 years, Tank protested. You risked your life to protect people you'd never met. How is that not heroic? Because heroes don't do what they do for recognition or gratitude, Bobby replied. They do it because it needs to be done, because they're the ones in position to do it. The moment you start thinking of yourself as a hero, you've missed the point. Tank considered this, trying to wrap his mind around the concept of heroism without ego. How do I start? How do I become that kind of person? Bobby smiled slightly, the first time Tank had seen him show any real warmth. You already have. You're here, asking the right questions, wanting to do better. That's how it starts. Across the park, Marcus and the others were watching the conversation with interest. They'd all been struggling with similar questions since that day, wondering how to make amends for their behavior and how to become better people. Would you be willing to talk to the others too? Tank asked. I think they're all going through the same thing I am. Bobby looked across the park at the small group watching them. Are they ready to hear what I have to say? Because some of it might not be what they want to hear. I think so, Tank said. I think we all learned something that day. Bobby stood up and walked across the park with Tank following behind. As they approached the group, everyone straightened up nervously. Tank says you all have questions, Bobby said without preamble. Is that true? Marcus nodded. We've been talking about what happened, about what kind of people we want to be. And what conclusion have you reached? Bobby asked. That we were on the wrong path, the pink-haired girl said. That we were wasting our lives being angry and stupid. Bobby nodded approvingly. That's a good start. But recognizing a problem isn't the same as solving it. What are you going to do differently? What followed was an hour-long conversation that would change the trajectory of 9 young lives. Bobby talked about service, about the difference between confidence and arrogance, about the responsibility that comes with strength. He told them stories from his military service. Not the exciting combat tales they expected, but quieter stories about helping rebuild schools, protecting civilians, and the bonds between soldiers who looked out for each other. The most important thing you can learn, Bobby said as the conversation wound down, is that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. The elderly man sitting alone might be a war hero. The young mother struggling with her groceries might be working 3 jobs to support her family. The teenager acting tough might be afraid and looking for acceptance. Tank thought about all the people he'd dismissed or mocked over the years, wondering what stories they might have been carrying. How do we make up for the damage we've done? By doing better going forward, Bobby replied simply. You can't change the past, but you can choose who you want to be from this moment on. As the group prepared to leave, Marcus had one final question. Will you be here tomorrow morning? And the day after that? Bobby smiled. Where else would I be? This is my park too. Over the following months, the park became something of an informal gathering place for Bobby and his unlikely group of students. Other young people drawn by stories of the conversations began joining them. Bobby found himself becoming an unofficial mentor, sharing lessons learned over decades of service with a new generation, hungry for purpose and direction. Tank eventually did join the military, inspired by Bobby's example. Marcus became a police officer, dedicating himself to protecting the community that had given him a second chance. The others found their own paths, teaching, social work, firefighting, but all carried forward the lessons they'd learned from a quiet old man on a park bench. Bobby continued his morning routine, but now he was rarely alone. The bench that had once been a place of solitude became a gathering point for meaningful conversations about service, sacrifice, and the courage to do what's right. And sometimes, when new troublemakers appeared in the park looking for easy targets, they found themselves face to face with a group of young people who had learned the difference between strength and brutality, between confidence and arrogance, between being feared and being respected. The cycle continued. One conversation at a time, one choice at a time, one person deciding to be better than they were the day before. Bobby had found his mission for retirement, not leading soldiers into combat, but guiding young civilians toward becoming the kind of adults their community needed. In the end, the old man on the bench had accomplished something even more important than stopping a predator or serving his country for 30 years. He had shown a group of lost young people that it was never too late to choose a better path, and that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when not to use that ability. The mocking had long since stopped. In its place was something much more valuable: respect, understanding, and the kind of friendship that forms when people choose to see past appearances and recognize the worth in every human being they encounter.